David had been living alone in his small mountain cabin for 8 long years. The 45-year-old man used to work as an engineer in the city, but life had other plans for him. After losing his wife in a terrible car accident, he couldn't handle being around people anymore. Everything reminded him of her, the crowded streets, the coffee shops they used to visit, even the sound of laughter from strangers. So he packed his few belongings and moved to this remote cabin that his grandfather had left him. It sat high up in the mountains, far away from everything and everyone. The nearest town was a 2-hour drive down a winding dirt road that most people wouldn't dare to travel. That's exactly how David wanted it. His days had become simple and predictable. Every morning, he would wake up at sunrise and make his coffee. Then he would sit on his wooden porch, looking out at the beautiful valley below. The mountains stretched as far as his eyes could see, covered in thick green trees that changed colors with the seasons. It was peaceful, but it was also lonely. David had learned to fix almost everything himself. When his solar panels needed cleaning, he did it. When his water pump broke down, he figured out how to repair it. When winter came and snow blocked his driveway, he would shovel for hours until he could get his old truck out. He had become completely self-sufficient, and he was proud of that. The cabin itself was small but comfortable. It had just 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, a living room with a stone fireplace, and a bathroom with running water that came from a well he had dug himself. The walls were made of thick logs that kept the place warm in winter and cool in summer. David had added bookshelves everywhere, filled with technical manuals, repair guides, and old novels that he would read by lamplight. His only connection to the outside world was his monthly trip to town for supplies. He would drive down the mountain with a shopping list, buy everything he needed from the small general store, and drive back home without talking to anyone more than necessary. The store owner, an elderly woman named Betty, always tried to make conversation, but David would just nod politely and pay for his things. People in town had started calling him the Mountain Man. Some were curious about how he lived up there all alone. Others thought he was strange or maybe even dangerous. But David didn't care what they thought. He had found peace in his isolation, or at least that's what he told himself. The truth was more complicated. Some days, the silence felt like a heavy blanket that suffocated him. He would catch himself talking to his reflection in the mirror, or having conversations with his old truck when it wouldn't start. He had pictures of his late wife hidden away in a drawer, because looking at them still hurt too much. But he convinced himself that this pain was better than trying to live in a world that felt empty without her. David had created routines that helped him get through each day. After his morning coffee, he would check his weather instruments. He had become something of an expert on mountain weather patterns. Then he would tend to his small vegetable garden, where he grew tomatoes, beans, and potatoes. In the afternoon, he would work on maintaining his equipment or chopping wood for the fireplace. Evenings were the hardest time. That's when the loneliness would creep in like fog rolling over the mountains. He would cook simple meals for one, eat in silence, and then read until his eyes got tired. Sometimes he would sit by the fire and remember better times, but those memories always made him sad. The seasons came and went. Spring brought wildflowers and baby animals. Summer was warm and bright, perfect for working outside. Fall painted the mountains in brilliant reds and golds. Winter covered everything in snow, making his world look like a Christmas card. But David barely noticed the beauty anymore. He was just surviving, one day at a time. He had learned to ignore the small sounds that could mean visitors, the distant rumble of an engine, the crack of a branch in the forest, even the occasional hiker who got lost and ended up near his property. David would hide inside until they went away. He had no interest in meeting new people or explaining why he chose to live this way. His old friends from the city had stopped calling years ago. His family members had given up trying to convince him to move back to civilization. As far as the world was concerned, David had simply disappeared. And that's exactly how he wanted it, but deep down, in a part of his heart that he tried to keep locked away. David sometimes wondered what it would be like to have someone to share his morning coffee with, someone to help him with the heavy work around the cabin, someone to talk to when the winter nights seemed to go on forever. He pushed those thoughts away whenever they came. People brought complications, pain, and disappointment. His mountain sanctuary was safe and predictable. Nothing unexpected ever happened here, and that's how he intended to keep it. David had no idea that his carefully controlled world was about to change forever. He didn't know that sometimes the universe has its own plans, and that the very isolation he treasured would soon be challenged by visitors. And like any he could have imagined, October had always been David's favorite month in the mountains. The leaves turned brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold, and the air became crisp and clean. But this particular October brought something that would change his life forever. The weather forecast had warned about a storm, but David wasn't worried. He had lived through many mountain storms over the years. His cabin was solid. His generator was full of fuel, and he had plenty of food stored away. What he didn't expect was how fierce this storm would become. It started around dinner time on a Tuesday evening. David was cooking a simple meal of beans and rice when he heard the wind picking up outside. At first, it sounded like the usual mountain breeze, but within an hour, it had grown into something much more powerful. The cabin began to shake slightly, and David could hear branches snapping in the forest around his home. By 9 o'clock, the storm was unlike anything he had experienced. The wind howled like a wild animal, making sounds that sent chills down his spine. Rain hit his windows so hard that he worried the glass might break. The temperature had dropped so quickly that he could see his breath inside the cabin, even though he had the fireplace burning. David put on his heaviest jacket and went outside to secure anything that might blow away. His porch chairs were already dancing around in the wind, and his small weather station was spinning wildly as he tied down loose items with rope. He noticed something strange in the sky. Between the dark storm clouds, there were lights moving in patterns that didn't make sense. They weren't lightning, and they definitely weren't airplanes. The lights were bright blue and green, swirling together like colored water mixing in a bowl. David stood frozen, watching these impossible lights dance across the stormy sky. Then, it happened. One of the lights suddenly grew much brighter and began falling toward the earth. It moved fast, much faster than anything David had ever seen. The light streaked across the sky like a shooting star, but it was huge and made a sound like thunder that never stopped. The impact shook the ground so hard that David nearly fell over. It felt like an earthquake, but he knew it wasn't. Whatever had fallen from the sky had crashed somewhere in the thick forest about half a mile from his cabin. For a moment, a strange blue-green glow lit up the entire valley, making the storm-soaked trees look like they were covered in magical light. David's mind raced as he tried to understand what he had just witnessed. As an engineer, he was used to logical explanations for everything, but this defied all logic. Weather balloons didn't glow like that, military aircraft didn't move in those patterns, and nothing he knew about could create that kind of impact and strange light. His first instinct was to go back inside, lock his door, and pretend nothing had happened. That's what the old David would have done, the David who had spent 8 years avoiding anything that might disrupt his carefully ordered life. He took a few steps toward his front door, ready to retreat into the safety of his cabin. But then he heard something that stopped him cold. Even through the howling wind and pounding rain, he could hear the sound of a child crying. It was faint but unmistakable, the desperate sobbing of someone very young and very frightened. The sound hit David like a punch to the chest. He hadn't heard a child cry in 8 years. Not since he had lost his own family. The memory of that loss was still so painful that he usually avoided places where children might be. But here, in the middle of nowhere, during the worst storm he had ever seen, there was definitely a child out there in the darkness. David stood in the rain, torn between his desire to stay safe and isolated and something deeper, a feeling he had buried for years. The crying continued, carried on the wind between crashes of thunder. It sounded like the child was hurt, scared, and completely alone. Every logical part of his brain told him to go inside. This could be dangerous. It could be a trap. It could be anything. But the crying grew more desperate, and David found himself thinking about all the what-ifs. What if a family had been driving through the mountains when the storm hit? What if their car had crashed? What if someone really needed help against his better judgment? David went back into his cabin and grabbed his emergency backpack. He stuffed it with first aid supplies, flashlights, rope, and energy bars. He put on his waterproof boots and his thickest coat. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. As he stepped back outside into the storm, David realized he was about to break the most important rule he had lived by for 8 years, the rule of staying away from other people and their problems. But the sound of that crying child had awakened something in him that he thought was gone forever. The trek through the storm-lashed forest was terrifying. Trees swayed dangerously overhead, and the rain made it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. David's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it seemed weak against the power of the storm. Several times, he had to duck as large branches fell around him, but the crying guided him forward, growing stronger as he got closer to where the lights had crashed. His heart pounded with fear and anticipation. Whatever he was about to find in those dark woods would either confirm that he was losing his mind or prove that the universe was far stranger than he had ever imagined. As he pushed through the last line of trees and entered a small clearing, David saw something that would haunt his dreams forever and change everything he thought he knew about the world. What David saw in that clearing made his legs feel weak. In the center of the small open space, there was a strange object that definitely wasn't from this world. It looked like a teardrop made of silver metal, about the size of a small car. The surface was smooth and seemed to glow faintly even in the darkness of the storm. Strange symbols were carved into its sides, and David could see that part of it was badly damaged. But it wasn't the crashed ship that made David's heart race. It was the two figures huddled next to it, both soaked to the bone and shivering in the cold rain. The woman was unlike anyone David had ever seen. She was tall, maybe 6 feet, with long arms and legs that seemed almost too thin. Her skin had a pale, silvery color that seemed to shimmer in his flashlight beam. Her hair was white as snow and hung in wet strands around her face. But it was her eyes that caught David's attention. They were large, much larger than human eyes, and they held a sadness so deep that it reminded him of his own darkest days. Next to her sat a little girl who looked to be about 7 or 8 years old. She was the one who had been crying, and David could see why. The child looked hurt and scared, clinging to the woman's arm like her life depended on it. What surprised David was that the little girl looked almost human, except for her slightly larger eyes and the faint shimmer to her skin that she shared with the woman. When his flashlight beam hit them, both figures looked up at him with expressions of fear and hope. The woman said something in a language David had never heard before. It sounded like music mixed with whispers, but then she switched to English, though her accent was strange and melodic. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "We need help. Our ship is broken, and my daughter is hurt." David stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Every logical part of his brain told him this couldn't be real. Maybe he had hit his head during the storm. Maybe he was dreaming. But the rain soaking through his clothes was real, and the desperate look in the woman's eyes was definitely real. The little girl whimpered something in that musical language, and the woman pulled her closer. David could see that the child had a cut on her forehead, and both of them were shaking from the cold. Whatever they were, wherever they came from, they were in trouble and needed help. "Can you walk?" David asked, surprised by how calm his own voice sounded. The woman nodded, though David could see it was difficult for her. She had a deep gash on her left arm that looked painful, and she was favoring her right leg. With great effort, she helped the little girl stand up. The child stumbled and nearly fell, but her mother caught her just in time. David found himself moving forward, his emergency training taking over. He had spent years learning first aid and wilderness survival, never thinking he would use those skills to help visitors from another world. He offered his arm to the woman, and after a moment of hesitation, she accepted his help. The journey back to the cabin was slow and difficult. The woman, who told him her name was something that sounded like Lyra, could barely walk. The little girl, whose name sounded like Zara, had to be carried part of the way. David found himself switching between carrying the child and supporting Lyra as they made their way through the dark forest. By the time they reached his cabin, all three of them were exhausted. David helped them up onto his porch and fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. As he opened the door and guided them inside, he realized he was about to break the most important rule of his isolated life. He was bringing strangers into his home. But these weren't just any strangers. As they stepped into his warm, dry cabin, David got his first good look at his unexpected guests. Lyra was beautiful in an otherworldly way, but her beauty was marked by exhaustion and grief. Her clothes were made of some kind of material David had never seen before. It looked like fabric, but seemed to change color slightly in different light. Little Zara looked even more human in the lamplight, though her eyes were definitely too large and too bright for a normal child. She stayed close to her mother, watching David with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Despite everything that had happened, she seemed remarkably brave for such a young child. David quickly got them towels and blankets, then started a fire in his fireplace as the warmth began to fill the room. Lyra's story came out in bits and pieces. She spoke carefully, as if choosing each word with great thought. She explained that she and her daughter had been traveling through space when their ship was caught in what she called a gravity storm. They had crashed on Earth by accident, and now their ship was too damaged to fly. She said they had nowhere else to go and no way to contact their own people. What struck David most was not the incredible story she was telling, but the way she told it. There was a deep sadness in her voice, especially when she mentioned that they were alone. David got the feeling that there was much more to their story, painful details, that she wasn't ready to share with a stranger. As he helped clean and bandage their wounds, David noticed that Lyra's injuries seemed to heal faster than they should. The cut on her arm, which had looked serious in the forest, was already starting to close. Zara's forehead cut had stopped bleeding completely, leaving only a faint mark. While he worked, David found himself talking to them in a way he hadn't talked to anyone in years. Maybe it was because they were so obviously in need of help, or maybe it was because their situation was so strange that his usual social fears didn't apply. Whatever the reason, he felt oddly comfortable with these unexpected visitors. As the night wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, David realized that his quiet, predictable life had just become incredibly complicated. He had two visitors from another world sitting in his living room, and he had no idea what to do next. The first week with Lyra and Zara was the hardest week David had experienced. Since moving to the mountains, his quiet, organized life suddenly became filled with voices, questions, and the constant presence of others. At first, he didn't know how to handle it. Lyra slept most of those early days, recovering from injuries that seemed worse than they appeared. She would wake up looking confused and frightened, as if she couldn't remember where she was. David would bring her soup and tea, speaking in quiet tones to reassure her that she was safe. Slowly, she began to trust him. Little Zara was different. Despite everything that had happened to her, she was curious about everything in the cabin. She would follow David around, watching him cook, clean, and tend to his daily tasks. At first, David felt nervous having a child so close. He hadn't been around children since losing his own family, and every laugh or cry from Zara brought back painful memories. But there was something special about this little girl. She seemed to understand that David was sad, even though they barely knew each other. Sometimes she would sit quietly next to him while he worked, not asking for anything, just keeping him company. Other times, she would bring him small gifts, a pretty rock from outside, a flower she had picked, or a drawing she had made with his old pencils. As the days passed, David learned more about his unexpected guests. Lyra explained that Zara was half human. Her father had been an Earth man who had somehow met Lyra years ago. David didn't fully understand how this was possible, but he could see the truth in Zara's features. She looked like a perfect blend of human and whatever Lyra's people were. The story of how they ended up on his doorstep was heartbreaking. Lyra's husband had been taken away by their government because he had fallen in love with a human woman on their world. This was considered a serious crime after he disappeared. Lyra and Zara became targets too. They had to run for their lives, stealing a small ship and trying to reach Earth where they hoped to hide. David found himself getting angry when Lyra told him these things. The idea that anyone would hunt down a mother and child because of who they loved made his blood boil. He had spent years avoiding human problems. But this wasn't just a human problem. This was about basic right and wrong. As Lyra got stronger, she began helping around the cabin in ways that amazed David. She looked at his solar panels one morning and made small adjustments that doubled their power output. She fixed his water pump with materials she found in his workshop, making it run quieter and more efficiently than it ever had. When David asked how she knew how to do these things, she simply said her people were good with machines. Zara, meanwhile, was learning about Earth life with incredible speed. David taught her how to read his weather instruments, and within days, she was predicting storms more accurately than his expensive equipment. She helped him in his garden, and somehow the plants seemed to grow better when she touched them. She even learned to cook simple meals, though she had to stand on a chair to reach the stove. The most surprising change was in David himself. For the first time in 8 years, he found himself looking forward to waking up each morning. There were people who needed him, who depended on him, and who seemed genuinely happy to see him. When Zara would run to greet him after he returned from checking his equipment, or when Lyra would smile and thank him for a simple meal, David felt something he had forgotten existed. Purpose. His daily routines changed completely. Instead of drinking his morning coffee alone on the porch, he would sit with Lyra and Zara, listening to Zara's excited chatter about the animals she had seen, or the dreams she had the night before. Instead of eating silent dinners, his kitchen was filled with conversation, laughter, and the sounds of a family. Lyra began sharing stories about her world, a place with 3 suns and cities that floated in the sky. She told Zara about her father, describing him as a kind and brave man who had risked everything for love. David found himself sharing stories too, talking about his life before the mountains, his work as an engineer, and even some memories of his late wife. The hardest moment came about 3 weeks after their arrival. David was outside chopping wood when he heard Zara scream. He dropped his axe and ran inside, expecting the worst, but he found her sitting at his kitchen table, crying over a broken cup, one of the few dishes that had belonged to his wife. David's first reaction was anger. That cup had been precious to him, one of the last connections to his old life. But as he looked at Zara's terrified face, he realized something important. The cup was just an object. The memories it represented were still safe in his heart. And this frightened little girl was more important than any piece of pottery. Instead of yelling, David knelt down and hugged Zara, telling her it was okay. Together, they cleaned up the broken pieces, and David told her stories about his wife while they worked. That night, Lyra thanked him with tears in her eyes, saying she had never seen such kindness from someone who barely knew them. As autumn turned toward winter, the 3 of them developed routines that felt natural and comfortable. David would wake up early and start the fire. Lyra would make breakfast using ingredients from his garden and pantry, creating meals that tasted unlike anything he had ever eaten, but were delicious. Zara would set the table and chatter about her plans for the day. During the day, they would work together on various projects around the cabin. Lyra's technical skills combined with David's practical knowledge made them an excellent team. Zara would help with smaller tasks, or simply keep them company with her endless questions and observations. Evenings were David's favorite time. They would sit by the fire, and Lyra would tell stories about distant stars and strange worlds. David would read to Zara from his books, and she would ask questions that made him think about familiar things in completely new ways. Sometimes they would just sit quietly, enjoying each other's company while the wind howled outside. For the first time since his wife's death, David felt like he was truly living instead of just surviving. 3 months had passed since that stormy night when David's life changed forever. The snow had started falling in the mountains, and his little family had settled into a comfortable winter routine. David had never been happier, but he should have known that happiness like this couldn't last. It was a clear, cold morning in January when everything changed again. David woke up earlier than usual, feeling restless for reasons he couldn't explain. As he made his way to the kitchen to start the coffee, he noticed that the usual sounds of morning birds were missing. The forest was completely silent, which was strange even for winter. When he stepped outside to check his weather equipment, David's blood turned cold. 3 large, silver objects hung silently in the sky above his cabin. They were much bigger than the ship that had brought Lyra and Zara to Earth, and they had a threatening appearance that made David's stomach twist with fear. He ran back inside and woke Lyra, shaking her gently. The moment she opened her eyes and saw his face, she knew something was wrong. When he told her about the ships outside, all the color drained from her already pale face. "They found us," she whispered, her voice filled with terror. Within minutes, beings began appearing around the cabin. They looked similar to Lyra but wore dark, form-fitting uniforms and carried weapons that glowed with blue energy. Their faces were cold and emotionless, nothing like Lyra's warm expressions. David counted at least a dozen of them surrounding his home. A tall figure approached the front door and spoke in that musical language David had heard before. Lyra translated with shaking hands. "He says we need to come out immediately or they will come in and take us." David's protective instincts kicked in stronger than ever. "No one is taking anyone from my home," he said firmly. "Tell them that. If they want to talk, they can talk to me too." Lyra looked at him with wide eyes. "David, you don't understand. These are military officers from my world. They don't negotiate with humans." But David was already moving toward the door. He had spent 3 months learning to be brave again, learning to care about something more than his own safety. He wasn't about to stop now. The leader of the group introduced himself through Lyra as Commander Thane. He was taller than Lyra, with silver markings on his uniform that suggested high rank. His large eyes were completely without warmth as he explained why they had come. According to the commander, Lyra was a criminal who had stolen valuable genetic material, meaning little Zara, and fled their world. The child was considered property of their government because of her mixed heritage. Both Lyra and Zara were to be returned immediately to face justice. David felt anger building inside him like he hadn't felt in years. "Justice," he said, stepping protectively in front of Lyra and Zara. "What kind of justice hunts down a mother and child?" Commander Thane looked at David as if he were an annoying insect. Through Lyra, he explained that humans couldn't understand the complexities of their society. He then made David an offer that chilled him to the bone. If David handed over Lyra and Zara quietly, the commander would erase all memory of their time together from his mind. David could return to his simple mountain life as if nothing had ever happened. He would wake up tomorrow morning alone, just as he had been before the storm, with no memory of the family he had learned to love. But if he refused to cooperate, David would be taken as well. He would be brought before their council to face charges of interfering with their law enforcement. The commander made it clear that humans who knew about their people rarely survived such encounters. "You have 1 hour to decide," Commander Thane said coldly. As the alien soldiers took positions around the cabin, David found himself alone with Lyra and Zara to make the most important decision of his life. Lyra was crying quietly, already preparing herself for the worst. She kept apologizing to David, saying she had brought this danger to his peaceful life. But it was little Zara who surprised them both. Despite being only 7 years old, she seemed to understand exactly what was happening. She took David's hand and looked up at him with those large, bright eyes. "You don't have to come with us," she said in her sweet voice. "We don't want you to get hurt because of us. You've been so kind to us already." David knelt down so he was at eye level with the brave little girl. "Zara, Do you remember what I taught you about families? She nodded. Families stick together no matter what. That's right, David said, feeling more certain than he had about anything in years. And you and your mother are my family now. Lyra gasped and tried to protest. But David had made up his mind. For 8 years, he had chosen the safe path. The lonely path, the path that protected him from pain and loss. But these 3 months with Lyra and Zara had taught him something important. A life without love, without people to care about and protect, wasn't really living at all. When Commander Thane returned for his answer, David was standing on his porch with his arms around both Lyra and Zara. His voice was steady and strong as he gave his response. My answer is no, David said. This is my family, and families don't abandon each other. If you want to take them, you'll have to take me too. The commander looked surprised that a human would choose to risk everything for aliens he had known for such a short time. But David wasn't finished. You say that Zara belongs to your government because of what she is, David continued. But she's not property. She's a little girl who deserves to choose her own life, her own family. And she's chosen us. What happened next surprised everyone, including Commander Thane. Little Zara stepped forward and began speaking in her mother's language, but somehow David could understand every word. Her mixed heritage was doing something amazing. She was creating a bridge between human emotions and alien logic. She spoke about love, about choice, about what it meant to be a family. She talked about David's kindness, about how he had saved them and given them a home when they had nowhere else to go. Her words carried a power that seemed to touch something deep inside, even the cold military officers. Commander Thane listened to the little girl's speech with growing amazement. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke to his soldiers in their musical language. David couldn't understand the words, but he could see that something had changed. The negotiation that followed lasted for hours. In the end, a compromise was reached that nobody had expected. Lyra and Zara would be allowed to stay on Earth under David's protection, but they would also serve as unofficial ambassadors between the two worlds. David's remote mountain cabin would become a secret meeting place, where the two species could slowly learn to understand each other. Commander Thane admitted that Zara's unique heritage made her valuable not as property, but as a bridge between worlds. Her ability to help humans and aliens understand each other was more important than any law there. Government had made dot as the alien ships prepared to leave. Commander Thane looked at David with something that might have been respect. You are either very brave or very foolish, human, he said through Lyra's translation. David smiled and pulled his family closer. Maybe both, he admitted, but I'd rather be foolish with people I love than safe and alone. That night, as they sat by the fire in their cabin, David realized that his journey from isolation to love was complete. He had started as a man who was afraid of losing anyone else he cared about. Now he was someone willing to risk everything to protect his family, even if they weren't related by blood. The man who had once lived alone by choice had become the guardian of the most important relationship in the history of two worlds, not because he was special or heroic, but because he had remembered how to love.